Good evening, good morning, good afternoon, depending on where you are. We're delighted that you could join us. My name is Margot Landman. I am Deputy Vice President for Programs at the National Committee on U.S. China Relations. This program is part of a one-year series on people-to-people exchange, bookended by the April 1971 visit of the U.S. ping pong team to China and the April 1972 visit of the Chinese ping pong team to the United States. One very important element of people-to-people exchanges is in the education sphere. We want to look specifically at one aspect of education, Chinese students in the United States. When Chinese students began degree study in the US in the early 1980s, if Americans thought about Chinese students at all, it was in neutral or positive terms. They could learn whatever they came here to study, as well as about the US more broadly, and Americans could learn about China through the students. More recently, however, things have gotten considerably more fraught as the numbers of Chinese students in the US have expanded greatly, and China has come to be seen by some as a competitor of the United States. We have with us now three experts who will explore several things. What motivates Chinese students to come to the United States? How do they benefit, assuming that they do benefit? And what is the impact on the United States? Our experts include Qianfeng Lin, currently a second-year student at Harvard Law School, Yingyi Ma, professor of sociology at Syracuse University, and a fellow in the National Committee's Public Intellectuals program, who conducts research and writes about the experience of Chinese students in the United States, particularly at the undergraduate level. And Nicky Shuwo Zhou, a former high school exchange student in the United States, a graduate of Penn State, and a former National Committee staff member who is joining us from Changsha, where she now lives. For more biographical information on all three panelists, please check out the event on our website. The URL is or will be in the chat. Thank you so much for agreeing to speak with us. Let's start with some background and context. Yingyi, the first question goes to you. Could you explain briefly why the US has been the top destination for Chinese students going abroad to study? What are the primary reasons, both push and pull factors? Is there reluctance, support, or some combination of the two from Chinese parents if their children want to study in the US?
Sure. Thank you so much, Margot, for your introduction and organization of this very important event. The primary reasons for China sending the largest number of students to the United States, or the US becoming the top destination for Chinese students, I think it's due to the education opportunities, especially higher education opportunities that the US can provide. So compared to China, for example, even though in the context of a pretty dramatic improvement of its higher education sector in terms of the rankings, and but still it's only placed just 3 universities in the top 100 of the most recent Times Higher Education World University rankings. But the US is home to almost 40 such universities. Don't discount such ranking. I know that the ranking is highly manipulated, and it's sometimes people have questions about it. Rankings has really, I wrote in my book, as a Bible, become the Bible of the college choice process for Chinese students and families. And the reason for that we can go to there if we want. It's largely because of the ignorance of or infamiliarity, lack of familiarity of Chinese students and their families with American higher education system. So in other words, it's really the quality of American higher education system that really attracts Chinese students. And even though improving the quality of China's higher education system takes time. And I would argue that the rise of Chinese higher education is not necessarily as predictable as the rise of Chinese economy, even though the two are highly correlated. So in short, I think it's still the quality of higher education system, the opportunities the US can provide to Chinese students. And in terms of reluctance or support, I think it's really the combination of both, and especially post-COVID or during the COVID, during this pandemic, the reluctance is really on the rise, and there are a lot of anxieties, a lot of reluctance on the parent side to send their children abroad. Thank you.
Thank you. Nikki, let's turn to you. Why did you decide to study in the US? And in what year did you come and what did you study?
So I decided to study in the US. It wasn't not really my own decision. My mom went to Europe in 2000, and that was her first time traveling abroad. And then she saw kind of the world outside of China. And then after she came back, and she said, oh, I have to send my daughter outside of China to see the rest of the world. And I'm from Changsha, as Margot mentioned, so it's not a coastal city. We didn't know a lot of people who studied or worked or even traveled abroad before. So my mom kind of groomed me and prepared me to study abroad. And when I finished middle school in Changsha, #1 middle school, she encouraged me to take the test to go to Yali High School, which was built by Yale China Association in Changsha. And Yale China Association would send fresh Yale graduates to Yali High School to teach English every year. So we knew that this was a really good school to study English and learn about American culture. And I did go to Yali for 1 year. And then in 2007, I became an exchange student because I tested out in a program from the Hunan Education Bureau to become an exchange student. So that's when I first came to the US. I was an exchange student to Florida, and that's how everything started. And then I stayed for 2 years, finished high school and went to Penn State. And then I studied international politics and education and public policy.
All right. And Qianfeng, I think you had a different route. When did you come and what did you study?
Yeah, my path is definitely shorter. And I came to the United States I think in 2016 after finishing my undergrad in China. I think what really motivated me is, like, other than what Professor March is talking about, not being a victim to the US news, it's really about trying to take control of my life. And so I went to the info session hosted by then the Dean of Columbia School of Social Work, Dean Takamura. And I just found like the work they do is so interesting. And perhaps I had too much drinks at that time and decided that, I want to give it a go. So I just jumped on the plane and flew right here.
You make it sound so easy. For both of you, could you talk a little bit about some of your expectations and whether they were met and what challenges you found along the way? Let's start with you, Qianfeng.
Yes, to be honest, upon reflection, I think I had more anxiety than expectations going to studying abroad. I was like thinking about, can I survive here? That's really the thing. That's only the question that my parents had for me. Are you sure you're able to survive outside alone? And in terms of expectation, I think I thought about the engagement of the faculty and with classmates, and I would like to think that those expectations are definitely met. I had a lot of conversations with my fellow classmates at Columbia School of Social Work and at Harvard Law, and I feel like the intellectual challenge or the sparks growing out of those conversations were definitely helpful for me to understand my past and what I want to do later on with the skill set that I developed.
It's quite a switch going from social work to law. What made you do that?
Yes, I hope this is not job interview. Yes. So yeah, I was doing clinical work after graduating from Columbia School of Social Work. I working as a case manager in Brooklyn, New York. And one day a client came to me with a green card issue, and he talked about he needed that for his employment benefit, and he couldn't get the assistance, like any real work done with the legal assistance in the neighborhood. So I just looked it up during the coffee break, and I found out there is a fee waiver for him. So I kind of became the guy you go to in our little program for the green card issue replacement. So like there is one section in the every form you file for to the USCIS for the attorney's signature. So just one day it came to me, I really want to put my name on that form one day. So I just start to look whether the door is still open for me, was still open for me, and it was. So I just decided to switch. Yeah.
We actually got a question that in some ways is related to what you've been talking about, because so much has changed over the years. As I said in my intro, this comes from Liu Huihua of Beijing Language and Culture University, where I will say I studied 100 years ago, but that's for a different program. Liu Huihua says, Chinese students going to the States after 2010 have had a totally different experience than those in the last 2 decades of the 20th century. In what ways do you three think your own experiences are different from each other and those before 10 or 20 or 30 years ago? Professor Ma, since you were among the earlier cohorts, why don't you start addressing that question?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. Actually motivated, the research for my book. My motivation to really focus on the rising wave of undergraduate students from China is exactly because my cohort doesn't really have much of a presence of undergraduate students. So my cohort, it's not just before 2010. It's even earlier than that. It's 10 years before that. Actually, the turning point that undergraduate students started to make inroads into American higher education is around 2007. It's actually 3 years before 2010, but definitely the second decade of 21st century has seen the skyrocketing growth of undergraduate students from China. And around 2014, undergraduate students has surpassed graduate students, becoming the majority of Chinese international students population in the United States. So the difference is really on the surface level, it's graduate students versus undergraduate students, and primarily PhD students, doctoral students like me. It's not just the level of education, more importantly, it's a funding source of this education. So for doctoral students, still so, most of the Chinese students are funded by American higher education. So they came here taking fellowship or research assistantship or teaching assistantship. Just like most of the American higher education at the doctoral level are fully funded, but at the undergraduate level, a huge majority of them are self-funded using family funds. And the difference, I argued in my book, really signifies the rise of China. It's part of the rise of China, is the manifestation of rise of China, that the upper middle class family, or even for some of the families, middle-class families, can afford this very pricey American higher education, often without a single financial aid. So I'll just stop here. We can talk about more.
Okay. Nicky, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. Yeah, because I came here and, kind of in between these two times. I came here in 2007, but as a high school student. So I think I kind of noticed that the change when I was in high school. I went to Florida and I was the only Chinese exchange student at my school. People around me, they never met a Chinese person before. They didn't know how I got there. So I think the understanding of China was very limited. Maybe in other regions, people who've had more international experience, it would be different back in 2007, but that was before the Olympics. So, when I spoke to people, people were first surprised to hear that I'm from China, but also my surprise was they were not that curious about China. They're just like, oh, okay, another foreign country. But then fast forward a decade, I think when I was working as national committee, and then also of course in New York, people knew a lot more about China and they were a lot more curious about China. And then they knew someone who studied in the United States who's from China. So I think I've really witnessed the change in the past couple of 10, 15 years.
Qianfeng, anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I guess I'm in the cohort that did not witness a change because I came in 2016. And when I got there, it's pretty natural to introduce myself that I came from China. I'm interested about the work you do here. So like the conversation went pretty smoothly there. And so I guess that's some more evidence to that there was a change. And I think with more Chinese students going to the United States and finishing their education there, the China will be that, I think this might be a good example. Usually when I introduce myself, I have to say that I'm from the south of China. Now they can understand which province that I came from. So I guess that's a little progress.
Interesting. Yingyi, you mentioned your book, the title of which is Ambitious and Anxious, and it came out just last year, but it's been quite a year. Combination of COVID-19 and increasing xenophobia, particularly from the former president. What do you think it looks like for future Chinese students? Will they continue to want to come to the US, and what might greet them here?
That's $1 million question, Margot. It has changed so much, I think, since the publication of my book. COVID-19 and the mismanagement of the pandemic in the United States has drastically changed the Chinese students and their parents' perception and the Chinese public perception about American society. So I think it's no exaggeration to say that the U.S. soft power has really been hugely undermined over the past 1 year. So in terms of Margot, your question about the future prospect of Chinese students to study in the United States. I wrote an article recently and published it in 6 tone, and I made this bold prediction that the US will continue to remain the top destination for Chinese students. Among this very high reluctance and reservation on the part of Chinese students and their families. And the reason being simply going back to our very original first question is what really attracts them here in the first place, which is about education opportunities. And the gap is still very, very large, and there is so many, a big number of Chinese students who are not able to get into the kind of colleges and universities they want in China. The education competition is huge, and just recently evidenced by this crackdown of this tutoring company. And this very fact that we have such a big tutoring company really speaks to this super competition, what we say the involution, right? We just say that 内卷 in China, and all of that really pushed so many students out of the system to come in here. And by the way, there are so many students already on the trajectory of international education sector that they're already out of the system. Mm-hmm. So you can just imagine how much anxiety and stress the students and families were under. Before, they're like coming to a better place, a country full of opportunities. And now it's still better opportunities in terms of education, but otherwise life, public health, future immigration, whether once they come back, once they come to the United States, whether they, when and whether they can come back to see their parents, everything remains very, very uncertain. So just, to put it simply, I would still predict the US will remain the top destination. We will see the dwindling number, the decline of Chinese students coming here. The peak has already passed.
Following on that, Nikki, you were going to come back for this fall and decided to stay in Changsha. What was behind the decision, and what does it tell us about the values of an American degree versus a Chinese degree or no advanced degree?
Yes, I originally planned to return to New York to attend Columbia for grad school. But as I was getting ready to come back and talking to my peers and family friends and other people in China, I was very surprised to hear, I think 90% of them asked me, why do you want to go back? Why don't you, if you really wanted, because I only had a bachelor's degree after Penn State, and I worked at the National Committee for 7 years. So I really wanted a master's degree, but this was the first time that I had heard from, but the majority of people that I talked to, that I just should get a degree in China, go to a local school, go to a local program. There are really good programs and schools in China. Why do you have to go back? And you've been there for so many years. So I think that really surprised me. I decided eventually to stay to explore business opportunity, because I think right now is a really good timing for me personally. But I was just very surprised to hear people telling me, just don't go back to the United States, stay in China. The degrees here are the same. The network, the people you will meet at these local programs will be more valuable to you if I stayed here for the program. If I went back to New York, then the connection I will be making will not be as important as, related to the connection I'll be making at a local program. So I think people, they are starting to value Chinese degrees more than they had before. But I think it's more than the degree. I think it's the quality of the graduates, because I also talk to a lot of people, companies who are hiring graduates, and they're saying they'd rather hire graduates from top Chinese universities nowadays than graduates from a pretty good American university, because they see maybe no difference in the terms of quality of work they do. Local graduates understand local situations better. And then when graduates return from overseas, they always say there's a period of time where they have to adapt to China again, although they are originally from China. And then so that 3-4 months, maybe half year, is cost for the company, that they have to kind of train them to get used to how a Chinese working environment works. So I think that's why a lot of parents are reconsidering whether they should send their kids abroad, especially if their kids are doing very well in school. Then the opportunity cost of going abroad, monetary, timing, distance from family, but also how they are valued afterwards in the career market. I think it's one of the reasons they're reconsidering.
Very interesting. Qianfeng, you're collecting professional degrees. You got a degree in social work, now you're getting a degree in law. Did you face pressure from people at home saying you should come back and work here in China rather than pursuing a second advanced degree?
Yes. So I think on the one hand, I'm lucky enough that I have my parents' support for the overseas education. But I do get from time to time they will say perhaps that might not be the ideal. like path for you economic wise, but that was mostly a response to the COVID, I think. Instead of the quality of the education that I want to do, they both agree that social work and the law are very interesting and promising field to engage in. So with that regard, I think I've been living in this bubble for quite a while. I cannot speak for the other field of practices, but I do think that the field that I chose, I mean, I really enjoyed my time at social work, and I'm also enjoying the time at law school. So I feel like, again, I think the concern mostly are, I think, derived from the COVID, I think most part.
We're going to ask a couple of more questions and then turn to questions from the audience, which have been coming in. And please don't hesitate. If you have a question, please submit it to the Q&A box. Yingyi, we've been talking mostly about high school, undergraduate, and graduate students, but visiting scholars have also been a significant presence of Chinese on American campuses. Could you say a few words about the situation for them? Is it fairly stable? Are their numbers likely to stay the same, to go up, to go down, and particularly in the STEM fields?
Visiting scholars very, very significantly going down during this pandemic. And this year, we've seen a lot of Chinese students coming back. And for my home institution, for example, it's largely business as usual. A lot of students make their way back successfully, a lot of new students, a lot of second-year returning students. But we don't really see much at all about visiting scholars. I think some of the reasons are having a lot to do with the visa situation, especially in STEM areas. This China threat, this implications, ramifications of China initiative, even though it's not really targeting visiting scholars, but there is a huge chilling effect. And also in terms of the cost benefit analysis, right? For Chinese students coming here, taking some risk, it is for their degree, it's their credential, it's their future. But for visiting scholars, even though before the pandemic, before the U.S. China frosty relationship, they're coming here for a year or two or even half a year is going to be a big boost to their career. I don't really know whether that's still part of the institutional arrangement, because that's part of Chinese higher education policy. A couple years ago, to be promoted from a lecturer to associate professor to full professor, everyone is encouraged to seek a visiting scholarship overseas. This pandemic just simply appended this policy, I guess, and that's why I don't really see much of the presence of visiting scholar here.
Thank you. We're going to turn now to audience questions as promised. We have one from Larry Dax, who is a retired Foreign Service officer. And he asks, is the increased hostility or perceived increased hostility towards Chinese students currently in the US affecting their plans to return to China? Are they going back early or not returning to the US to complete their studies if they went home during the pandemic? Yingyi, I think that's a question for you.
Absolutely. I think there is a huge chilling effect, the current fraught bilateral relationship. And, but again, there is a huge push effect. That means this kinds of policy or foreign policy that's not friendly to Chinese students and also to immigrants in general, foreign students, it's going to be a huge problem for the US. We're the nation that benefit from the brain gain, right? Yeah, so we're gonna see a lot of brain loss for sure. But at the same time, I just want to remind folks that the Chinese labor market is super competitive, too. So used to be that they welcome people with overseas job experience. People like Nicky with 7 years of experience with National Committee, I'm pretty sure that that kinds of job experience would be helpful for their the future labor market experience in China. So it's actually hard just with an American degree to go back to get a job. It's actually helpful if they can get some working experience in the United States. So it's those kinds of sort of competing forces. I think on one hand they push students to return. On the other hand, there is some kind of incentive to stay, at least to temporarily, so that they can gain some competitive advantage back home.
Thank you. Here's a question for you, Nicky. Part of the American college experience is living with roommates. Have you noticed over the course of your experience in the US that Chinese parents want their children to live with fellow Chinese? And if you were in the shoes of an American administrator responsible for dorm assignments, how would you handle this? This question, somewhat adapted, comes from Charlotte Mason.
Yes, my experience at Penn State was, I think Chinese students do tend to stay with other Chinese students. And then when you get an opportunity to choose your own roommates, they tend to choose other Chinese students. I think this is because, you are nervous traveling abroad on your own for the first time. So if you meet someone from your hometown, you speak the same language, you have the same habit, as probably many of the audience know, Chinese people have a lot of different habits that are strange to non-Chinese. So I think this will probably create some kind of nervousness to Chinese students. If I did this, would my roommate who's non-Chinese think that I'm weird? Why do I do this? And so if another person is also Chinese, maybe it's easier to live together. And that's definitely the situation when I attended college. But I think as for an American college administrator, I naturally think they would encourage all the students to be mixed up together so that they can learn from each other, from different culture backgrounds, to maybe even study each other's language. But I think the school probably needs to do a little bit more training or give a little bit more aid to international students who habitually like to stay together. Because I think, there is a lot of Chinese students on each campus. So it's easy for them to find another Chinese student who is willing to room with them. But say if you're from, Kazakhstan, where there are only 20 students at this campus, maybe you don't even know the other 10. You maybe only know other 5 or 7. So the chances of you rooming together is not as high as the chance of you finding another Chinese roommate. So I think, maybe encourage them to explore the roommate choice situation a little bit more, but also give them more aid and explain to them, if you choose another, a local American student, you will be able to learn more about the culture, you will adapt to the language environment faster, but also I think speak to the potential roommate who's not from China and maybe ask whether they want to be roomed with a foreign student. And there are a lot of students who are interested in rooming with foreign students. I think so. Provide a little bit more aid to the students before you just sign them together. Because I know when I was in college, other Chinese students had bad experience with, say, American students or non-Chinese because their living habit was so different. So, then midway through the semester, they would go to school and then request to change the dorm. And I think that did happen, quite often in the Chinese student community and, based on various reasons. So I think maybe a little bit more prep before you just put two people together. Yeah.
Yeah, I think more preparation on both sides, on all sides, would be very helpful. Here's a question for you, Qianfeng. This comes from Yu Zhou, who's a professor at Vassar. There is a lot of talk about the Chinese government's influence on American campuses, controlling Chinese students. At the same time, Chinese students also learn about democratic values, free speech, and critical thinking. To what extent is the influence of the Chinese government so powerful that it outweighs the effects of American education, or is such influence exaggerated?
That is a very good question. So for me, especially in the law school environment, I took the right of free speech and especially the right of freedom protected under the First Amendment very seriously. And I personally have not yet received any pressure from the Chinese government to like, so I have to choose between A and B. I feel like this is me talking from the bubble that living in, and I think I'm not sure that's the answer like to the question, but I do feel like after spending time in the United States, after getting exposed to different values, after to really have personal time to deliberate whether those are the values that you are really found deeply associated with, I think that speaks like carry much stronger weight than the other external forces that one may expect or face.
We have a couple of comments going towards Nicky, or one comment and one question. The comment comes from Kelly Tsai at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. She says, Nicky's comment resonates with what we have seen here in Hong Kong. Just to share anecdotally, 2 of our freshmen this year turned down offers from Harvard and NYU respectively to study at the Hong Kong University of Science and Technology. Also, our MA applications increased by nearly 50% this year. So that's pretty interesting. And then the other question for you, Nicky, comes from an anonymous attendee. I think you hit the nail on the head when you said employers prefer a top Chinese university over a pretty good US university. But does the reverse hold true? Do Chinese employers prefer a quote unquote top US degree over a mid-tier Chinese degree? Does this vary depending on graduate or undergraduate?
I think definitely a top university is still the top choice. You know, someone like Qianfeng who went to Columbia and will be graduating from Harvard is definitely any employer's top choice. I think the Chinese perspective and also the job market still values top American university education a lot. That's still, I don't think that will change. They appreciate the quality of education and they know the quality of the graduates are very high. So I think that is definitely, they will value a top university from the United States more than a mid-tier Chinese university, if you know they're competing for the same position, same job. But I think in terms of college and a bachelor's degree and master's degree, I think the trend in China is everybody has a master's degree. They go to, they go to the master's program right after bachelor's degree or 1 year or 2. So when, at least my observation after I came back to China is most people who are my age, they have already gotten a master's degree. So I think I don't know whether there's a huge difference between whether you got it a bachelor's degrees from the US or a master's degree in terms of a job preference. But I think generally many people, when they apply for jobs in China, they have a master's degree. So it's probably a little bit, you have a little bit advantage if you have a master's degree just applying for a job during a job search.
Thank you. We have a question that any of you could address. I think maybe start with Professor Ma. This comes from Mort Holbrook. what is the current attitude of the PRC government towards study in the United States? And then he expands it towards any study outside of China.
I think the policy is not, the government policy is not very much sort of uniformly strong or for or against. I think they're still pretty neutral. There is just some recent regulation in terms of international education sector that they're trying to separate out, trying to regulate international education and separate out from the public education sector. And that doesn't really limit the flow, the outbound flow. I think Chinese government is still wanting its students and its public to have the best education possible. At the same time, invest huge amount of money into its own higher education sector, trying to retain and recruit, the best faculty, the best students. So there is not a uniform sort of a restriction. There is not a policy that sort of discourage. I don't really see that is coming. At the same time, they're trying to improve the sort of the internationalization of their own system, trying to recruit. That's at least before the pandemic. There is a huge amount of increase of international students in China, that they have been able to attract a lot of students from Global South, for example.
Following on that, I wonder, a lot of the highest leaders in China have themselves studied abroad. What has that made a difference in their thinking, in their policies, not just towards study abroad, but more generally? Professor Ma, you want to take a stab at that?
Yes, I would want to follow and further that point, that it's not just the highest leaders themselves have the overseas experience like Liu He, right? But also there, if you're looking at the children of those elites, not just political, but all across the society, the children of political, academic, business elites, you're going to see that overwhelmingly they share this similarity that years ago, or over the past decade or so, they send their children abroad. And some of them returned to China, some of them stayed overseas. So I think as a country, the elite sector, including its political leaders, recognize the significance, the value of overseas education, not just in terms of skills, but also in terms of horizon, in terms of the ways of thinking, in terms of social capital, all kinds of connections. So on all those fronts, I think it's the perception is that study abroad is a positive.
Well, maybe countering that a little bit comes a question from Anthony Moretti, a professor of communication at Robert Morris University in Pittsburgh. He says, Dr. Ma spoke of U.S. soft power cratering of late. She's right. What is the most optimistic view as to when that might change, and what has to occur to foster a change in public perception in China? Any one of you could address that if you wish.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah. You said earlier on that U.S. soft power took a beating under the previous administration. What is the most optimistic view as to when that might change, and what has to occur to foster a change in public perception in China?
Well, I think the election of Biden administration has projected that optimism already. There is this understanding that Biden administration is more welcoming international students. And there is some kinds of policy support for that kind of optimistic perception. For example, the visa this year, the visa issuance rate is pretty fast, and there are a lot of people getting their visas very successfully. And recently, there is this waiver of interviews. All those are sending positive signals for some students. At the same time, the American government has not really fundamentally changed the previous administration's policy towards Chinese students and Chinese scientists in particular. And so even though Chinese students are not the direct targets of the Department of Justice China Initiative, for example, I think the mere presence of so many students in STEM fields were really feeling the chilling effects and this sort of hostility by the U.S. government, and all of that is not consistent with the optimistic expectation for the new administration. Not very new now, but relatively new. Yeah.
Can I just follow up on that?
Sure.
I just wanted to add. Also, I think there's from the China side, how China talks about the United States and talks about the U.S. China relationship. I think that also has a large impact on how Chinese people view the United States and this bilateral relationship. I think in general, at least from kind of the news I see on the official TV, they've been way more patriotic than before. So I think that has an effect on just people watching the news, and then what they learn about the United States, they learn about what the United States does to the rest of the world, what the policy is within the United States. So I think that changes a lot of people's perception about this country. So if you're a parent whose children are in middle school and high school and deciding whether they want to send their kids to the United States, and then if themselves they have never been to the United States or studied in the United States, they would not understand, the core of American education, the quality of the American education, and then how it would expand someone's perspective, like Dr. Ma said, your horizon. And then if they get their information solely from kind of the news they get within China, then I think naturally they would not want their kids to be in the United States, because it just seems like it's a relatively toxic environment for their children to be in. So I think unless you know somebody who studied in the United States, or yourself studied there, or you did a lot of study, as someone who's never done any of that, it's very easy for them to think, I would rather not send my children to the United States.
We've received a question that follows on that quite nicely. It's from KW, whom I think may be Catherine Wilhelm. If I'm wrong, please forgive me. She asks, or whoever KW is asks, are Chinese students this fall encountering an extension of the anti-Asian sentiment that we've seen surge in the US since the start of the pandemic? And two, do the panelists feel that the education they've gotten in the US has been not just valued by the job market in China, but actually better than they could have gotten at home? Do they have regrets or feel that they made the right choice? There are a lot of questions in there. Qianfeng, do you want to tackle that first? Lawyer to
yes,
lawyer.
I can. Yes, so let me try to recall. The first question, I think, is about whether this fall we still encounter anti-Asian sentiment. Yes. So I cannot speak for the whole community, but at least from what I observe, there hasn't yet been a report of such a direct incidence where we observe anti-Asian action against a fellow Chinese student. And also with the because law school in particular, I think at least Harvard Law is very vigilant on these kind of issues. And so I would like to think things will become better going forward. But also there is also an argument that the policies may be a little bit too abstract to enforce real change. And so I guess I can give a yes and no answer to it. I think I'm happy to see that I'm involved in the China Law Association and happy to get a report from incoming students like this year's first year students saying that they got harassed of that kind. But I think there will be more work to be done. Talk to like what Professor Ma was talking about, the general anti-Asian sentiment against Chinese students at large and Chinese scholars.
Nicky or Yingyi, would you like to add anything to that? No? Okay. All right, we can move on then. We have a question from Terry Louts, who for many years was with the Henry Luce Foundation and then was at Syracuse and is now working on yet another book, which we're looking forward to seeing. Could any of you comment on interactions between students from the PRC, Taiwan, and Hong Kong when they've come to U.S. universities? What are your experiences? Why don't we start with you, Yingyi, since you came earliest?
Well, I really am glad to hear from Terry. And Terry's a good friend at Syracuse, and I'm trying my best to address your question now. So I don't really personally, I don't really have much of an interaction. During my years, that was really a long time ago, not 100 years ago, but at that time, the politics among students from PRC and Hong Kong and Taiwan are not really prominent among our social interactions. And I think over the recent years, you do see those kinds of tensions sometimes, especially among undergraduate students. I think somehow graduate students, you don't really see that visibly playing out in terms of those interactions. But undergraduate students, you do see that there is a rising nationalism among students from PRC. And it's actually interesting at this point. I want to probably tie this question with Yu Zhou's earlier question about this, how come the influence of Chinese government so powerful, especially in the context of the students in American higher education receiving the liberal arts education, critical thinking training, democracy. And I think it's actually not really, perhaps not really interpreted that way, that it's all, you see that this rising nationalism among Chinese students overseas. And the West, the media, the pundits observe that as the influence of Chinese government. It may not be. I think this power of the influence of Chinese government is probably exaggerated, and to a great extent, it is the Chinese students themselves, their experience with American society. And from my research, that especially, the critical thinking skills, they very much, majority of them acknowledge that they attribute their critical thinking skills to American higher education, that at times, very ironically, make them critical about American society. Before their education in American higher education, they have this romanticized view. They have imagined American society to be this and to be that, and their lived experience And especially this pandemic, this anti-Asian racism, this xenophobia, doesn't really help at all with those kinds of rising nationalism. So to some extent, I think it's a confluence of factors really that fuels those rising nationalism among students from PRC. So, you know, I'll stop here and see whether Nicky and Qianfeng can add.
Well, before we go to them, there's a question from Bob Cap that fits perfectly with what you just said, Yingyi. He writes in, I wonder if anyone might comment on the content of their educational experiences in the US, methods of instruction, especially valued courses or topics of study, etc. Quote unquote, instrumental planning, aiming at jobs, income, connections, fame, and fortune are on many Chinese families' minds, it seems. But is there any consideration of the content of the educational experience itself? Qianfeng, you're nodding. Why don't you start?
Yes, I think that's the major reason why I decided to pursue a second postgraduate degree. I think law school branded itself with the Socratic method, where professor calls on students to answer questions in the classroom, and we did that in the Zoom environment. And I feel like it is I think is a kind of set of skills that one will develop at a law school that fundamentally attract me to say that, okay, I want to do this, despite that they give a lot, like very pricey price tag for the education you're going to buy. And so I think for me, at least in my personal experiences, I think that the educational experience itself matters in my decision-making process. And yeah.
Thank you. Nicky, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. Yeah, I really echo with Dr. Ma's comments earlier that I think it's the, the openness, the conversation style, classrooms, and, the way that you can talk about anything, you can express your opinions and then have a conversation, and you can debate, you can logically debate and think about different issues. I think that kind of mindset in the United States is so natural that people don't think other countries' students may not have had it in their, secondary education or earlier. So I think it's, having that in a U.S. college and a master's degree program environment that, Chinese students here, at least me, I was able to learn how to think critically and how to debate with people and also express my opinion, but also appreciate other people's feedback and criticisms. I think I really didn't have a lot of that before I came to the United States. So I think it's that ability that I've gained in the United States through the American education system makes me feel like I understand the Chinese society better than I used to be, but then I also understand American society than before I came here, or, outside of the news that I see when I was back in China. So I think it's kind of a double-edged sword that you're learning more about this country, but also then you're learning more about China. And I think that's why Dr. Ma mentioned many students who studied here became more patriotic than they came before. And that's my observation as well, is because then you learn that, okay, so there are a lot of problems in the United States as well. And then maybe the problems that I observed in China, I now understand why they occurred. Yeah.
That's a terrific answer, Nicky. Thank you very much. We're almost at the end of our time, so I will give the last question to Jan Barris, Vice President of the National Committee. But before I read her question, I want to apologize to all of those who sent in really terrific questions. We just don't have time for them. Jan's question is, the overall theme of this and several other programs in this series is that of people-to-people interaction. As Nicky was here as a high school student living with an American family, she was very integrated into her local community and can honestly say that she had a people-to-people experience in the broadest sense. But did Yingyi and does Qianfeng feel that they got to know Americans beyond the students/faculty with whom they came in contact in the course of their day-to-day student life? This is a problem for all foreign students, but it is amplified for Chinese students because the PRC population at so many universities is so large that those students can live in their own bubble without ever really getting to know America or Americans. Let's start with you, Qianfeng, and then give the last word to Yingyi.
Yes, I definitely get that sentiment of being living in the bubbles. But I think, like, speaking of the law school experiences so far, because of COVID, I'm mostly associated with my section mates. We have 7 sections in Harvard Law. So I think there are like plenty of interactions where I can talk to American students and other international students talking about the issues that we discuss in the class, our opinions of politics in the United States, our opinions about politics elsewhere. So I feel like you can really pursue like a more integrated conversation with your fellow classmates talking about stuff once you reach out, and the conversation can start very easily. I used to just write an email to my section classmates talking about, like, raise a great point about X, Y, and Z. Can we talk more about it? So I think that's like a very good conversation starter for me to get to know more about the friends, and also because Zoom environment, there has been like no really after class chit chat near the classroom. So I think reaching out would be a good option. Has been a good option for me. Yeah.
Thank you. Yingyi?
So I think usually graduate students have more of an independent lifestyle. A lot of them have families, and they don't really have those kind of liberal arts core like course requirement as undergraduate students. So so undergraduate students are supposed to have more opportunities for social integration than graduate students. But as Jan has said very correctly, that given the size of Chinese students right now and the lack of external support at the institutional level, the lack of social integration for undergraduate students is pretty enormous. So I actually spent quite a bit of time in the book talking about it, this challenge of social integration that Chinese students want it, but they're not able to get it. And those kinds of frustration actually feeds into this critical assessment and disappointment, even disillusionment about their Chinese students have over American society. So before, they were like very favorably impressed through a lot of popular media, like Friends, those kinds of shows, and showing the very outgoing and this very friendly American community. But that's not what they have experienced on many campuses. So that's actually the findings I've got from my research, that this lack of social integration for the most part of undergraduate students that I did not really expect. So I think, going back to the earlier question in terms of the roommates, I think living arrangement can really make a lot of changes. And we have learning communities, and I don't really understand why many universities do not really have those kind of international learning communities, so that people who are willing to get international exposure, they're more committed to making changes, right? Nicky said that, life habits are very, very different, but for people who are willing to who are willing to be open-minded, who are willing to try to get exposed, we have that kind of international community. I think that's a kind of institutional changes that can make a difference.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to close, but before we do, audience members, you will receive an evaluation form shortly after we conclude. We really appreciate your feedback, so please complete the survey. It won't take you long. Many thanks to our wonderful speakers, to our audience, and to my colleagues who have made today's interview possible. And for those of you who will celebrate, 祝你们中秋节快乐. May you have a clear, round, full moon, much delicious food, and a wonderful gathering with family and friends. Thanks again, and goodbye.